Hello, we will now begin the graduate seminar for Week 15, focusing on Proto-Orthodox devotion, consolidation of binitarian worship and doctrinal developments. Larry W. Hurtado, Lord Jesus Christ, Devotion to Jesus in Earliest Christianity, Grand Rapids, William B. Geerdman's Publishing Company, 2003, Chapter 10. Welcome to our advanced seminar on New Testament Christology. Today, we are embarking on a profound journey into the consolidation of binitarian worship and the doctrinal developments that shaped Proto-Orthodox devotion to Jesus. Our very first topic today is the Aramaic dilemma of the Son of Man. We will begin by addressing one of the most contentious linguistic and historical debates in New Testament scholarship. Professor Larry Hurtado, drawing upon decades of academic discourse, points out that Vermes and subsequent scholars such as Casey have tended to rest their views heavily on Aramaic texts from periods considerably outside Jesus' time, and on evidence from Aramaic dialects other than that of 1st-century Roman Judea and Palestine. Let us pause and unpack what this truly means for our understanding of historical Jesus research. For a very long time, scholars simply lacked contemporary texts from the exact era in which Jesus lived. Imagine, if you will, a future historian trying to understand the nuanced slang of Shakespearean London by reading a newspaper from modern-day New York. The linguistic drift, the semantic shifts, and the cultural reorientations over centuries are absolutely immense. Scholars like Gaza Vermes and Maurice Casey had to rely on later Targumic and rabbinic sources, or the Genesis Apocryphon, simply because 1st-century Aramaic texts were exceptionally scarce. Based on these later texts, they assumed that the Aramaic phrase bar Anash was merely a generic way of saying a human being, entirely devoid of any titular or particularizing force. They essentially argued that Jesus was just referring to himself as a guy or humanity in general, meaning his words carried no profound Christological weight. However, this methodological vulnerability has been profoundly exposed by recent archaeological and linguistic findings. As Hurtado notes, in a survey of a number of relevant Qumran Aramaic texts, Owen and Shepard present some significant findings, the broad effect of which is to place in strong doubt the claim that the Aramaic equivalents to Son of Man were simply the ordinary ways of referring to human beings generically. This shifts the academic landscape entirely. The continuing publication and rigorous analysis of the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran finally gave us a window into the actual Aramaic dialects spoken in Judea and Palestine during the exact period Jesus walked the earth. When Paul Owen and David Shepard looked closely at these chronologically relevant texts, they found that the linguistic rules proposed by Casey and Vermes simply did not hold up to scrutiny. The idea that Jesus was using a common, non-specific idiom is no longer historically viable. This isn't just a dry debate about ancient grammar, rather, it is a crucial debate about identity and self-understanding. If Jesus used an expression that was capable of singling him out, capable of carrying a highly specific meaning, then his self-referential speech was much more profound than a mere colloquialism. We are witnessing here the linguistic bedrock upon which the early church built its massive Christological architecture. The Aramaic bedrock matters immensely, because it proves that the high Christology of the early church was not a Hellenistic invention imported decades later, but rather, it was deeply rooted in the very speech patterns and self-consciousness of Jesus of Nazareth himself. Moving deeper into our linguistic analysis, our second topic is Qumran discoveries and linguistic precision. We must look at the exact mechanics of the Aramaic language as it was spoken by Jesus and his contemporaries. Professor Hurtado summarizes a critical point from Owen and Shepard's research, stating, there seems to be scant basis for the claim that in the Aramaic dialect of Jesus' provenance, the semantic distinction between the definite and absolute forms of nouns had eroded away, which means it is dubious to assert that bar Anash and bar Anasha likely had undifferentiated meanings. To understand the gravity of this, we need to talk about morphology. In Aramaic, nouns have an absolute form, which is indefinite, like saying a son of man, and a definite or emphatic form, which is like saying the Son of Man. Scholars like Maurice Casey had built their entire theory on the assumption that by the 1st century, these two forms had blended together in everyday speech, losing their distinct meanings. They claimed people used them interchangeably without thinking. But the Qumran texts, which act as a linguistic time capsule from the 1st century, prove this assumption completely wrong. The semantic distinction had not eroded away. Grammar still mattered. The precise endings of words still carried specific weight. Therefore, when Jesus spoke, the specific form he used would have been noticed and understood as carrying a deliberate, particular meaning by his audience. Furthermore, Hurtado argues, the extant evidence suggests strongly that the definite form was not in common usage and was not used interchangeably with the absolute form. In fact, Owen and Shepard point out that the definite singular expression, bar and asha, doesn't even appear in the Aramaic texts from Jesus' geographic and chronological provenance. It only shows up clearly in Eastern Aramaic texts written centuries later. If the definite form wasn't common in everyday Judean speech, and if standard words like Enash or Gabar were the typical ways to say a man, then the Aramaic phrase underlying the Son of Man was highly unusual. It was not a throwaway phrase. It was a carefully chosen, highly specific expression. The fact that the early bilingual Christians preserved it so obsessively indicates that Jesus' own speech practice was extraordinary. He adapted idiomatic expressions to convey something profoundly unique about his own identity and mission. This shatters the minimalist view of Jesus' self-understanding, showing us that his language was as radical and distinct as his theology. Now, let us turn our attention from the Aramaic background to the Greek text itself. Our third topic is the Greek innovation, focusing on the phrase ho huios tou anthropou. When the earliest followers of Jesus began to spread the gospel beyond the borders of Palestine, they had to translate Jesus' Aramaic teachings into Greek, the lingua franca of the Roman Empire. And here, they did something incredibly strange. Professor Hurtado highlights this linguistic anomaly, noting, the expression is unprecedented in Greek, and apparently novel in construction. Not only does ho huios tou anthropou not occur prior to the Gospels in extant literature composed in Greek, it is also not found once among the scores of times the translators of the Greek Old Testament rendered the Semitic expressions for a son of man. Think about how astonishing this is. Greek was a rich, expansive language with a massive literary history. Yet, this exact phrase, with its double definite articles, the Son of the Man, literally translated, had never been written down before the Gospels. Even the scholars who translated the Hebrew Bible into the Greek Septuagint centuries earlier never used this specific grammatical construction when they translated the Hebrew phrase Ben Adam. They usually used a form without the definite articles. So, where did this clunky, completely non-idiomatic Greek phrase come from? Some scholars, like Maurice Casey, tried to argue that it was just a bad translation, a clumsy mistake made by people struggling to render Aramaic into Greek. But Hurtado completely rejects this notion of accidental translation interference. He states, I think it far more likely, thus, that ho huios tou anthropou was deliberately constructed from the first by, and in, bilingual circles of Jesus' followers to serve as his distinctive self-referential expression in conveying his sayings in Greek. This is a monumental point. The early bilingual Christians, those who spoke both Aramaic and Greek perfectly well, intentionally created a new, slightly bizarre Greek phrase. Why? Because the standard Greek didn't have a phrase that carried the heavy, particularizing, sacred weight of what Jesus actually said in Aramaic. They were trying to capture lightning in a bottle. They wanted the Greek readers to stumble over the phrase a little bit, to realize that this was not ordinary speech. It sounded somewhat scriptural, like Bible Greek, but the definite articles gave it an emphatic force. It pointed directly and exclusively to Jesus. They invented a new linguistic container because the Christological content of Jesus' self-awareness was too immense to fit into standard vocabulary. This brings us to a crucial conceptual distinction in our fourth topic, title versus idiom, the semantic function. For generations, many theologians and laypeople alike have assumed that when Jesus called himself the Son of Man, he was claiming a well-known, pre-existing apocalyptic title, like taking up a recognized political office. But the linguistic evidence points us in a different direction. Professor Hurtado emphasizes the extreme exclusivity of the phrase, observing, the function of the expression is further indicated in the fact that Jesus is not only the sole referent of its 81 uses in the Gospels, he is also the only one who uses it. It is a salient feature of Jesus' idiolect, his own way of speaking. An idiolect is the specific, unique way a single individual uses language. Out of all the characters in the New Testament, nobody ever walks up to Jesus and says, "Hello, Son of Man." And after the resurrection, the apostles in the book of Acts and in the epistles do not go around preaching that Jesus is the Son of Man. The phrase is locked almost exclusively onto the lips of Jesus himself. This tells us something profound about how the early Christians viewed these words. Hurtado clarifies this by stating, in an important sense of the word, the Son of Man is not a title. That is, it does not designate an office or figure previously established and identified by this expression in the speech patterns of pre-Christian Jewish circles. Instead of being a badge of office he put on, it was a highly emphatic, self-referential speech formula. It functioned more like a proper name, but a name that carried deep semantic meaning. When Jesus said it, he was pointing to himself as the human being, the definitive human figure of destiny. The early Christians recognized this phrase as a sacred, untranslatable part of their Master's voice. Out of deep reverence, they refused to adopt it into their own everyday worship vocabulary. They preserved it like a linguistic holy relic, placing it only in the mouth of Jesus when recounting his sayings. It is a striking example of early Christian conventionalization, showing that across all the gospel communities, there was a unified, reverent agreement to preserve the exact, unique cadence of the historical Jesus. As we synthesize these linguistic findings, we arrive at our fifth topic, the Christological paradox, Son of Man and Son of God. When we read the Gospels, we are not just reading history, we are entering a deeply theological discourse world. And in this world, the way Jesus refers to himself collides beautifully with the way the authors describe his ultimate nature. Professor Hurtado articulates this dual emphasis, noting, in the discourse world of the canonical Gospels, this emphatic way of referring to Jesus as human functions along with the clear assertion of Jesus' transcendent significance, even his intrinsic divinity. This concept of intrinsic divinity, a term borrowed from Philip Davis, is absolutely vital. The Gospels do not portray a mere human teacher who is later turned into a god by his followers. From the very beginning of the canonical texts, there is a deliberate pairing of two distinct filial categories. You have Jesus, acting in the dust and heat of first-century Galilee, getting hungry, showing emotion, and referring to himself emphatically as the Son of Man. But simultaneously, you have the voice from heaven at the baptism, the demons shrieking in terror, and the authors themselves declaring him to be the Son of God. As Hurtado masterfully explains, the one designates Jesus operating in the human historical sphere, and the other discloses the higher significance of who this human figure really is. This dynamic relationship is the beating heart of early Christian Christology. The early Christians were not confused by this paradox, they worshipped precisely because of it. The phrase, the Son of Man, anchored Jesus strictly within the chronological, ethnic, and political realities of Roman Judea. It proved his supreme solidarity with the human condition. Yet, it was this exact, particular human being who was the embodiment of the divine presence on earth. You cannot understand the devotion to Jesus in earliest Christianity without holding these two realities together. It is not a contradiction to be resolved, but a mystery to be embraced. The human descendant is the divine Son. The historical actor is the transcendent Lord. This synthesis is operative from the very first verse of Mark's Gospel. This leads us directly into our sixth topic, Mark's scriptural matrix, the way of the Lord. As we transition to analyze the specific portrait, or rendition, of Jesus provided by the Gospel of Mark, we must recognize the foundational architecture of his writing. Mark did not write his Gospel in a theological vacuum. Professor Hurtado notes, Mark links his story of Jesus with a larger narrative world of scriptural Old Testament prophecy and personages, and also with the early Christian proclamation of the Gospel. From the very first breath of the Gospel, Mark binds the story of Jesus of Nazareth to the ancient, sacred texts of Israel. Relying on the brilliant exegetically work of scholar Joel Marcus, Hurtado points our attention to the opening verses of Mark. Right after the title, Mark unleashes a composite quotation from Isaiah, Malachi, and Exodus. The text says, "Prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his paths." In its original Old Testament context, the Lord being spoken of is Yahweh, the God of Israel. But in Mark's narrative, the messenger is John the Baptist, and the Lord whose way is being prepared is undeniably Jesus. By doing this, Mark makes an unimaginably profound Christological statement right out of the gate. He intimately and inextricably associates Jesus with the God of Israel. Jesus' earthly ministry is the unfolding of the eschatological presence of God among his people. But Mark doesn't just use explicit quotations. He weaves unintroduced citations and incredibly subtle allusions throughout the text. For example, when Jesus heals the deaf and mute man in Mark 7, the specific Greek word used for mute is found nowhere else in the New Testament, and only in Isaiah 35 in the Greek Old Testament, which prophesies the miraculous blessings of the eschatological age. Hurtado concludes, the text of Mark seems to presuppose readers for whom the Old Testament functions very importantly in shaping and expressing their life world of religious vocabulary, symbols, and fundamental beliefs. Mark assumes his audience is listening with scriptural ears. They aren't just reading a biography of a miracle worker, they are reading the explosive, real-time fulfillment of Israel's deepest hopes. To read Mark correctly is to read it through the lens of the prophets. Let us shift our gaze from theology to ethics in our seventh topic, discipleship and Markan realism. One of the most striking features of the Gospel of Mark, especially when you read it side by side with Matthew and Luke, is how raw and earthy its depiction of Jesus is. Drawing on the work of John Donahue, Professor Hurtado highlights the intense human realism of Mark's Jesus. This Jesus feels violent displeasure, he groans deeply in his spirit, he flashes with anger, and he openly admits he does not know the day or the hour of the final judgment. Matthew and Luke tend to soften or omit these raw edges, but Mark highlights them deliberately. Why? Because Mark is writing an intensely pastoral document. This realism serves a distinct exhortational purpose. Hurtado argues, the Markan emphasis on Jesus as example explains the treatment of the 12. Mark presents the 12 in a noticeably more negative manner than any other gospel. If you read Mark closely, the disciples look terrible. They are spiritually dull, they misunderstand the parables, they argue about who is the greatest, and ultimately, they completely desert Jesus, with Peter cursing and denying him. Some radical scholars in the past tried to argue that Mark hated the 12 apostles and was writing a hit piece against them. But Hurtado completely dismisses this. He explains that their failures serve as vivid warnings to readers that following Jesus is a difficult and dangerous venture. Mark is holding up a mirror to his own persecuted congregation. He is saying, look at the greatest heroes of our faith, Peter, James, and John. When the pressure was on, they cracked. Do not be arrogant. Discipleship is a matter of life and death. Quoting Philip Davis, Hurtado notes, we have in Mark a story of Jesus that is shaped just like the life of disciples. The Markan storyline is a blueprint for the Christian life. This explains the very structure of Mark's book. Notice that Mark has no birth narrative, and his original ending has no glorious resurrection appearances. Why? Because it maps perfectly onto the experience of the reader. The reader's Christian life begins with baptism, just as Mark's gospel begins. The reader's life involves mission, persecution, and the threat of death, just like the body of the gospel. And the reader's life requires blind trust in the promise of God's future vindication, just like the abrupt ending at the empty tomb. Jesus is the ultimate paradigm for how to suffer and how to trust. To truly comprehend the urgency of Mark's message, we must look at our eighth topic, the historical crucible of Mark's gospel. Books are not written in a vacuum, and the Gospel of Mark was forged in the fires of an unprecedented global crisis. Hurtado points to the apocalyptic language of Mark chapter 13, known as the Olivet Discourse, and states, "It is a reasonable supposition that the traumatic events connected and contemporaneous with the Jewish revolt against Rome in 66 to 72 are reflected in Mark 13 especially, and that the author saw in these distresses particular dangers to the believers for whom he wrote." Let us transport ourselves back to the late 60s of the 1st century. The world seemed to be ending. In Judea, a massive, bloody rebellion had erupted against the Roman Empire, culminating eventually in the horrific destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple. Meanwhile, in Rome itself, the Emperor Nero had unleashed a psychopathic wave of persecution against the Christians. According to Roman historians, believers were covered in pitch and set on fire to illuminate Nero's gardens. During this nightmare, the great pillars of the Church, the apostles Peter and Paul, were violently martyred. The trauma inflicted upon the early Christian community was unimaginable. Hurtado argues forcefully, in the midst, or the aftermath, of such events, it may well have seemed particularly timely to warn believers about being led astray by false prophets and false hopes, and to emphasize that followers of Jesus must not be discouraged from proclaiming their message. Many Christians, under the excruciating pain of Roman torture, apostatized. They denied Christ to save their own lives. This is why Mark focuses so intensely on Peter's catastrophic failure and denial in the courtyard of the high priest. Mark uses the technical Greek vocabulary of apostasy to describe what Peter did. But Mark also includes the angelic promise that Peter will be restored. This was a profound pastoral strategy. Mark was speaking directly to the broken, traumatized Christians of Rome, telling them that even if they had failed in the face of torture, even if they had denied the Lord just as Peter did, there was still grace, there was still restoration, and there was still a place for them in the kingdom of God. The Gospel of Mark was a survival manual for a persecuted church. Before we transition to the later Gospels, we must pause for our 9th topic to address a fascinating, yet highly contentious, academic debate, textual integrity and the secret mark controversy. Over the past few decades, sensational theories have periodically captured the attention of the media and the academic fringe. One of the most prominent was promoted by Harvard scholar Helmut Kester, based on a controversial discovery made by Morton Smith in the 1950s. The theory suggested that the Gospel of Mark we have in our Bibles today is actually a heavily edited, watered-down version of an earlier, more esoteric text known as Secret Mark, and that Matthew and Luke utilize different proto-versions of this text. Professor Hurtado, representing the overwhelming consensus of rigorous textual critics, firmly rejects this elaborate hypothesis. He states plainly, claims that an earlier and significantly different writing, for example, secret mark or a proto-mark, was used by the authors of Matthew and Luke have justifiably been judged unpersuasive by most scholars. The whole theory relies on a supposedly ancient letter from Clement of Alexandria found in the Mar Saba monastery, which many experts strongly suspect is a modern forgery. Even if the letter were somehow genuine, the text it describes would not be the original Mark, but rather a bizarre, secondary, 2nd century edition created by a Gnostic or esoteric sect trying to insert their own secret initiation rituals into the Jesus story. Hurtado lands his conclusion with definitive scholarly weight. This textual evidence also allows us to say with reasonable confidence that our estimates of what kind of writing Mark originally represented, and why it was originally composed, must, and can, be based on critical editions of canonical Mark, not on some putative writing such as secret Mark. We do not need to chase academic ghosts or conspiracy theories to understand Christian origins. The canonical text of Mark, preserved in thousands of ancient manuscripts, is a robust, historically anchored document. It was this powerful, canonical Mark, ending with the empty tomb in chapter 16 verse 8, that fundamentally reshaped the literary landscape of antiquity and served as the direct foundational source material for the authors of Matthew and Luke. Finally, we arrive at our 10th topic, concluding part 1 of our seminar, Matthew's augmentation and the virginal conception. While the Gospel of Mark was a blazing pioneer, the early church quickly realized they needed a more comprehensive theological textbook. Enter the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew essentially swallowed Mark whole, incorporating roughly 90% of Mark's text into his own. Yet, Matthew's Gospel is nearly 60% larger overall. Why? Because the author deeply respected Mark, but felt the story needed vital expansions to address the specific needs of his community. Professor Hurtado notes, Matthew presents an augmented storyline, with significant new material at the beginning and end of Mark's story. The first major augmentation of Mark is the nativity account. Mark begins with Jesus as a grown man at the Jordan River. But Matthew, like Luke, felt it was absolutely necessary to explain exactly where Jesus came from. This brings us to the profound and controversial tradition of the virginal conception. Where did this idea come from, historically speaking? Some highly skeptical scholars, like Jane Schaberg and Gerd Ludemann, point to a bizarre, hostile reference in Mark chapter 6, verse 3, where the crowds sneer at Jesus and call him the Son of Mary. In patriarchal Jewish culture, a man was always identified as the son of his father. To call him the son of his mother was often a direct insult, implying illegitimacy. These skeptical scholars argue that Jesus was actually historically illegitimate, and that the early church invented the beautiful myth of the virgin birth decades later merely as an apologetic cover-up to hide a shameful family secret. But Professor Hurtado systematically dismantles this skeptical reconstruction. He argues that this approach makes absolutely no sense logically. If your religious leader is being mocked for being illegitimate, the absolute worst offense you could possibly invent is to say, well, actually, he has no human father at all. That would just invite more vicious mockery. Instead, Hurtado presents a much more compelling historical sequence. He states, I think it more likely that the claim that Jesus was miraculously conceived circulated originally, not as a reply to slurs about Jesus' birth, but as a doxological statement intended to assert Jesus' significance. In other words, very early on, perhaps within 20 or 30 years of the resurrection, Christians were already formulating high Christological theology. They were declaring in their worship, in their doxology, that Jesus was so entirely pure, so completely sent from heaven, that his very origin in the womb was a miraculous act of the Holy Spirit. It was this high, beautiful theology that provoked the Jewish polemics. Non-believers heard the Christians preaching about a miraculous conception, rolled their eyes, and responded with the vicious slur found in Mark 6, mocking him as a bastard. The theology came first, the polemical insult came second. Matthew took this early, doxological tradition of the Holy Spirit's intervention, and masterfully wove it into the majestic narrative of chapters 1 and 2, forever grounding the story of the Son of Man in the miraculous initiative of the God of Israel. Thank you for joining me in this deep dive into the foundations of Proto-Orthodox devotion. The Aramaic linguistic background, deconstructing the Vermes-Casey consensus. Welcome to this highly specialized segment of our seminar, where we will plunge into the linguistic bedrock of the most debated phrase in all of the New Testament. If you want to understand early Christian devotion to Jesus, you must understand how Jesus spoke about himself. For decades, the academic consensus, heavily championed by brilliant scholars like Gaza Vermes and Maurice Casey, was that when Jesus called himself the Son of Man, he was just using a common, everyday Aramaic idiom that meant a human being, or a person. They argued it was a generic phrase, devoid of any majestic or unique claim. Let us look at what our text says about this. Vermes and subsequent scholars such as Casey have tended to rest their views heavily on Aramaic texts from periods considerably outside Jesus' time, and on evidence from Aramaic dialects other than that of first-century Roman Judea and Palestine. Now, I want you to really think about the profound implications of this critique. What happens when you try to understand the historical Jesus using documents written hundreds of years after he lived, in a completely different geographical region? The linguistic landscape changes. Languages evolve, dialects shift, and grammatical structures erode or solidify. Our author provides a masterful analogy here, pointing out that doing this is a bit like using modern American English to propose the meanings of words and expressions in Elizabethan English texts. Imagine trying to translate Shakespeare's Hamlet using the slang of a modern-day teenager in New York. The nuances would be utterly lost, and you would inevitably misinterpret the core meaning of the text. This is precisely what happened in New Testament scholarship regarding the Son of Man debate. Scholars were forced to use these later Jewish targums because, quite frankly, they did not have enough first-century Aramaic texts available. But that all changed dramatically with the ongoing publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran. Suddenly, we had a window into the exact Aramaic dialect spoken during the time and in the general locale of Jesus. Let us turn to our second critical insight from the text. In a survey of a number of relevant Qumran Aramaic texts, Owen and Shepherd present some significant findings, the broad effect of which is to place in strong doubt the claim that the Aramaic equivalents to Son of Man were simply the ordinary ways of referring to human beings generically. What Owen and Shepherd discovered is absolutely revolutionary for Christology. They proved that the Aramaic spoken by Jesus and his earliest followers had not lost the distinction between definite and absolute nouns. In simple terms, saying a Son of Man was grammatically completely different from saying the Son of Man. The Aramaic language of that specific era had a rich vocabulary, using words like Enash and Gabar when they just wanted to talk about a generic man. Therefore, if Jesus was using a specific form of the phrase Son of Man, he was not just blending into the crowd as an ordinary human. He was utilizing a distinct, highly particularized phrase that pointed directly and exclusively to himself. This completely shatters the older scholarly consensus and paves the way for us to see that Jesus' own speech patterns were the direct catalyst for the high Christology that would explode in the early church. The linguistic evidence now firmly supports the idea that Jesus was making a unique, emphatic claim about his identity right from the beginning. The grammatical reality, definite versus absolute forms in Qumran Aramaic. As we continue to dissect the linguistic foundations of Christological devotion, we must look very closely at the actual grammar of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I know that ancient grammar can seem dry, but I promise you, the theological stakes here are incredibly high. The entire debate hinges on whether the Aramaic speakers of Jesus' day had become lazy with their grammar. The older scholars argued that the line between saying a Son of Man and the Son of Man had completely blurred, meaning Jesus was just speaking casually. But the hard evidence from Qumran tells a radically different story. Let us examine the text together. First, there seems to be scant basis for the claim that in the Aramaic dialect of Jesus' provenance, the semantic distinction between the definite and absolute forms of nouns had eroded away, which means it is dubious to assert that bar enash and bar enasha likely had undifferentiated meanings and were used somewhat interchangeably. This is a devastating blow to the older theories. It means that when someone in first-century Judea spoke, they were highly precise. If they wanted to say a man, they used the absolute form. If they wanted to point to a very specific, singular man, they used the definite form. They did not mix them up indifferently. The precision of the language proves that we cannot just flatten Jesus' words into generic humility. He was not just saying, "I am merely a human being." The grammar itself pushes back against that reduction. Now, let us move to the second major point from our reading. Second, in fact the Aramaic definite singular expression, bar enasha, is only clearly attested in Eastern Aramaic materials that derive from a period several centuries removed from the historical Jesus, and does not appear in the Aramaic texts of Jesus' provenance. This is the smoking gun of this entire academic debate. The specific phrase that scholars for decades claimed was just a common idiom for a man does not even show up in the contemporary texts of Jesus' geographic area. It is a ghost phrase in first-century Judea. When the people of Qumran wanted to write about a normal man, they used entirely different words, like gabar or enash. Therefore, if Jesus used an Aramaic phrase that eventually became translated into the famous Greek phrase the Son of Man, he was using language in a highly specialized, intensely focused way. He was stepping outside the normal conversational bounds to designate himself in a way that demanded attention. The Gospel writers did not invent a high Christology out of thin air, they were faithfully translating the startling, particularizing self-reference that Jesus himself initiated in his native Aramaic tongue. The linguistic data demands that we see Jesus as the sovereign architect of his own unique identity. The Greek innovation, ho huios tu anthropou. We have looked at the Aramaic roots, but now we must cross the language barrier into Greek, which is the language our New Testament is actually written in. When we read the phrase the Son of Man in English, it flows quite nicely. But to a native Greek speaker in the 1st century, the phrase ho huios tou anthropous sounded incredibly strange, clunky, and completely novel. It was an absolute linguistic anomaly. It is critical to understand that the Gospel writers were not just reaching for a common Greek idiom. Let us look at what Hurtado highlights about this phenomenon. Not only does ho huios tou anthropou not occur prior to the Gospels in extant literature composed in Greek, it is also not found once among the scores of times the translators of the Greek Old Testament rendered the Semitic expressions for a son of man. This is a massive point. Think about the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. There are many places in the Hebrew Bible where the phrase Son of Man appears, such as in the book of Ezekiel where God constantly addresses the prophet. But the Greek translators of the Old Testament never, not even once, used the exact grammatical formula that we find in the Gospels. They never used the double definite articles. They never wrote the Son of the Man. Furthermore, even in the apocalyptic literature like the Greek translations of 1st Enoch, this specific phrase is completely absent. So, where did it come from? Some scholars, like Maurice Casey, tried to argue that it was just a messy translation, a case of linguistic interference where bilingual speakers accidentally forced Aramaic grammar onto Greek words. But let us see how our text addresses that theory. I think it far more likely, thus, that ho huios tou anthropou was deliberately constructed from the first by, and in, bilingual circles of Jesus' followers to serve as his distinctive self-referential expression in conveying his sayings in Greek. The awkwardness of the Greek is not an accident, it is the entire point. The early bilingual Christians, who understood both Jesus' native Aramaic and the Greek of the broader Mediterranean world, realized that Jesus' self-designation was so unique, so deeply particular to him alone, that normal Greek simply could not capture it. So, they forged a new phrase. They bent the Greek language to accommodate the sheer uniqueness of Jesus Christ. They packed it with definite articles to scream to the reader, this is not just any man, this is the man, the specific, prophesied, singular human figure of ultimate destiny. This bizarre Greek phrase became a sacred hallmark of early Christian devotion, a linguistic monument to the fact that Jesus did not fit into any pre-existing categories, not even grammatical ones. The semantic force, speech formula versus pre-existing title. Now we arrive at a crucial paradigm shift in how we understand New Testament Christology. For a very long time, theologians and historians have casually referred to the Son of Man as a title. We group it alongside words like Messiah, or Lord, or Son of David. We assume there was a clearly defined job description in ancient Judaism called the Son of Man, and Jesus simply stepped up and claimed the role. But the historical data tells a much more nuanced and fascinating story. Let us read our author's emphatic declaration on this matter. I repeat for emphasis, in an important sense of the word, the Son of Man is not a title. That is, it does not designate an office or figure previously established and identified by this expression in the speech patterns of pre-Christian Jewish circles and traditions. This is a profound recalibration of our understanding. Unlike the title of Messiah, which had centuries of Jewish expectation, political hope, and prophetic literature defining exactly what the Messiah would do, there was no empty chair waiting for someone called the Son of Man. It was not an office. So, if it is not a title, what exactly is it? It is what linguists call a fixed speech formula. Let us look at the next portion of the text to understand how this formula worked. It functioned, thus, more in the way a name functions, to identify and distinguish a person, in this case Jesus. However, unlike proper names, the Son of Man also had a semantic meaning, referring to Jesus as the particular human figure. It is a brilliant linguistic maneuver by Jesus. By adopting this unique formula, he avoids the heavy, militaristic baggage associated with the title Messiah. He creates his own category. It functioned like a name, identifying him exclusively, but it carried the profound theological weight of identifying him as the ultimate human descendant. This also beautifully explains a peculiar feature of the Gospels: Jesus is the only person who ever says this phrase. You never see Peter, or Paul, or John calling Jesus the Son of Man in their everyday preaching or in the epistles. It belonged exclusively to the idiolect, the personal vocabulary, of Jesus. The early Christians recognized this. They had such immense reverence for the historical memory of how their master spoke that they preserved this phrase as a sacred relic of his actual voice. They fenced it off, reserving it only for the lips of Jesus in the narratives. This incredible consistency across all four Gospels proves that the Son of Man was not an invention of the later Church, but the bedrock of Jesus' own historical self-understanding and self-revelation. The Christological paradox, human particularity and intrinsic divinity. As we synthesize the linguistic data we have just covered, we must now look at how the Gospel writers actually utilized this unique phrase within the broader landscape of their narratives. The Gospel writers did not just throw different titles at Jesus randomly, they orchestrated a profound, dialectical theology. They constructed a narrative world where two seemingly opposite realities about Jesus are held in perfect tension. This is the heart of what we call the Christological paradox. Let us turn to the text to see how this operates. In the discourse world of the canonical Gospels, this emphatic way of referring to Jesus as human functions along with the clear assertion of Jesus' transcendent significance, even his intrinsic divinity. This latter emphasis is what seems to be included in the presentation of Jesus as God's Son. The Gospel writers are deliberately pairing these two distinct filial categories, the Son of Man and the Son of God. When Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, he is anchoring himself deeply and irreversibly into the human experience. The Gospels are relentless in their realism. They place Jesus in the dirt and dust of first-century Roman Judea. He is subject to the politics of Herod and Pilate. He gets tired, he bleeds, he feels sorrow. The phrase Son of Man captures this extreme, gritty human particularity. He is the ultimate human representative operating on the stage of human history. But, as our text reveals, this is only half of the portrait. Surely, early readers of these accounts could not have avoided the pairing of these two related and contrasting ways of referring to Jesus in filial terms, as the Son of Man and God's Son. The one designates Jesus operating in the human and historical sphere, and the other discloses the higher significance of who this human figure really is. You see, while the Son of Man grounds Jesus in humanity, the title Son of God, or as Mark frequently uses, my beloved Son, or the Son of the Blessed One, tears open the heavens to reveal his true origin. It points to what Philip Davis calls his intrinsic divinity. This dynamic interplay is magnificent. It prevents the early Christians from falling into the trap of Docetism, the heresy that said Jesus only appeared to be human. By fiercely preserving the Son of Man formula, the Gospels insist that the divine Son of God actually suffered in the flesh. This dual reality, perfectly human and intrinsically divine, became the absolute bedrock of what we call proto-Orthodox binitarian devotion. The early Church worshipped him alongside the Father precisely because they recognized that the human figure from Nazareth was simultaneously the transcendent Lord of Heaven. Mark's narrative world, scriptural embeddedness and the way of the Lord. Moving forward, we are going to zero in on the unique theological architecture of the Gospel of Mark. Mark is often considered the earliest Gospel, and its raw, fast-paced narrative is deceivingly simple. Beneath its surface lies a highly sophisticated, deeply scriptural matrix. Mark does not just sprinkle Old Testament quotes into his story for flavor, he actually constructs the very DNA of Jesus' identity using the prophecies of the Greek Old Testament. The very opening sentences of the Gospel serve as a massive, theological thesis statement. Let us look at how Hurtado unpacks this opening sequence. Immediately after what I take to be the author's intended title for the Gospel, an explicit quotation is attributed to Isaiah, which functions to introduce the entirety of the Markan account of Jesus. Behold, I send my messenger before your face who will prepare your way. A voice crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Now, this is actually a composite quotation blending the books of Isaiah, Malachi, and Exodus. In the original Old Testament context, the Lord whose way is being prepared is Yahweh, the God of Israel. The prophet Isaiah is promising that God himself is going to march back into Zion to rescue his people. But notice what Mark does here. He takes this blazing prophecy of Yahweh's return and applies it directly to Jesus of Nazareth. As the scholar Joel Marcus has brilliantly shown, the entire rest of Mark's Gospel is a presentation of Jesus walking this way of the Lord. By doing this, Mark is making a breathtaking Christological statement right out of the gate. He is associating Jesus so closely with the God of Israel that the actions of Jesus are presented as the actions of God himself on earth. Let us consider the next critical observation from the text. The unintroduced quotations suggest intended readers who could recognize the quotations readily enough without an explicit marker. Indeed, the allusions suggest a still more impressive familiarity with the specific Greek wording of the Old Testament writings in question. Mark expects a lot from his audience. He assumes they are completely soaked in the Greek scriptures. For example, when Jesus heals the deaf and mute man in Mark chapter 7, Mark uses a highly specific, rare Greek word for mute that only appears in one other place in the entire Greek Bible, the magnificent prophecy of Isaiah chapter 35, which speaks of God coming to save his people, opening the ears of the deaf and the mouths of the mute. Mark does not pause to explain this connection. He trusts his readers to hear the echo. Thus, the miracles of Jesus are not just random magic tricks, they are the eschatological drama of the Old Testament exploding into present reality. Mark's Gospel is a masterpiece of showing, rather than just telling, that Jesus is the culmination of all scriptural hope. The call to discipleship, failures of the 12 as paradigmatic warnings. One of the most striking, and frankly, shocking elements of the Gospel of Mark is how terribly the disciples behave. If you read Matthew or Luke, the disciples certainly make mistakes, but the edges are softened. In Mark, however, the 12 are consistently portrayed as dull, uncomprehending, fearful, and ultimately, absolute failures. For a long time, scholars like Theodore Wheaton argued that Mark deliberately wrote his Gospel as a political attack against the 12, suggesting they represented a heretical group that Mark hated. But modern scholarship, and our author Larry Hurtado, see this very differently. Let us examine the text to understand why Mark paints such a bleak picture of the apostles. As many have observed, Mark presents the 12 in a noticeably more negative manner than any other gospel. But it is simplistic to take this as merely an attack on them. Instead, their failures serve as vivid warnings to readers that following Jesus is a difficult and dangerous venture. Mark is not interested in church politics, he is engaged in profound pastoral care. Mark is writing to a community of Christians who are terrified, facing the very real threat of martyrdom. Following Jesus is not a theoretical exercise for them, it is a matter of life and death. Therefore, Mark uses the disciples as literary and theological foils. They represent the very real human weakness of the readers. The climax of this failure occurs during Jesus' trial. While Jesus is standing faithfully before the high priest, boldly confessing the truth, Mark cuts away to Peter in the courtyard. Peter does not just tell a little lie, Mark uses technical, heavy terminology of apostasy. Peter denies and curses his association with Jesus. Let us look at how the text explains the pastoral purpose behind this agonizing scene. These failures include not only dullness but also desertion and even apostasy. But both in Jesus' prediction and in the post-resurrection announcement that confirms its validity, their restoration is posited, their failures overcome by Jesus' own contrasting faithfulness and authoritative summons. This is the magnificent grace of Mark's Gospel. He shows Peter committing the ultimate sin of apostasy, the very thing Mark's persecuted readers were terrified of doing under Roman torture. But Mark does not end Peter's story there. The young man at the empty tomb specifically says, "Go, tell his disciples and Peter, that he is going ahead of you to Galilee." By highlighting their catastrophic failure, and their subsequent restoration by the authoritative grace of the risen Christ, Mark provides an incredible safety net of hope. He is telling his readers, following Jesus is a brutal path, and you might fail just like the apostles did. But Jesus' faithfulness is greater than your failure, and his grace can restore even the apostate. Mark as a blueprint for the Christian life. Now we must ask a fundamental structural question about the Gospel of Mark. Why does it look the way it does? If you open Matthew or Luke, you are treated to beautiful, miraculous accounts of angels, shepherds, wise men, and the birth of a baby in Bethlehem. But Mark drops you right into the wilderness with a screaming prophet and an adult Jesus getting baptized. Furthermore, Matthew, Luke, and John all end with glorious, comforting scenes of the resurrected Jesus eating fish, breaking bread, and talking with his disciples. But the original text of Mark ends incredibly abruptly at chapter 16 verse 8, with the women fleeing the empty tomb in terror and silence. Why would Mark write a story like this? The answer lies in realizing that Mark is not writing a simple biography, he is writing an existential roadmap. Let us read what Hurtado and scholar Philip Davis suggest. We have in Mark a story of Jesus that is shaped just like the life of disciples. In the words of Philip Davis, the Markan storyline is a blueprint for the Christian life. It begins with a baptism and then issues in mission, opposition, and persecution involving death, and ends with divine vindication by resurrection. This insight completely unlocks the Gospel of Mark. Every major structural decision Mark makes is designed to mirror the lived experience of the persecuted Christian communities he is writing to. Think about the missing birth narrative. Whether Mark knew about the virgin birth or not is irrelevant, he excluded it because it did not fit his blueprint. The readers of Mark's Gospel did not begin their Christian life as physical babies, they began their new spiritual life in the waters of baptism. Therefore, Mark begins his paradigm of the Christian life at the waters of the Jordan. As Jesus comes out of the water, he is immediately driven into the wilderness to fight Satan. This tells the reader, your baptism is not just a nice ceremony, it is a declaration of war. Let us consider the implications of this blueprint further. As Christians, their life too began with their baptism, and Mark emphasizes that they too are called to follow Jesus in proclaiming the gospel and with a readiness to undergo persecution, trusting that if they lose their life for the sake of Jesus and the gospel, they shall receive eschatological vindication. This structural genius extends to the very last sentence of the gospel. Mark denies his readers the comfort of seeing the resurrected Jesus, because in their daily reality of facing Roman swords and lions, they could not physically see the resurrected Jesus either. They had to live strictly on the promise that he had risen, trusting the empty tomb and the word of the angels. Mark ends abruptly because the story is not over. The reader is required to step into the narrative, take up their cross, and finish the story with their own lives, trusting entirely in the vindicating power of God. Historical provenance, the crucible of Rome and the Jewish revolt. Context is everything in historical theology. If we want to understand why Mark wrote with such breathtaking urgency, why his Jesus is so focused on the cross, and why he demands such total sacrifice from his followers, we have to look at the world out of the window where Mark was sitting. The Gospel of Mark was not written in a peaceful monastery, it was written in a geopolitical pressure cooker. The scholarly consensus places the writing of Mark right around the late 60s or early 70s of the first century. This was arguably the most terrifying and chaotic decade in the history of the early church. Let us read how Hurtado frames this historical reality. It is a reasonable supposition that the traumatic events connected and contemporaneous with the Jewish revolt against Rome in 66 to 72 are reflected in Mark 13 especially, and that the author saw in these distresses particular dangers to the believers for whom he wrote. Let us unpack the sheer scale of these traumas. First, you have the great Jewish revolt breaking out in Judea. The Roman legions are marching through Palestine, burning towns, and eventually laying a devastating siege to Jerusalem and destroying the temple. Meanwhile, the Roman Empire itself is tearing apart at the seams. In the year 68, the Emperor Nero is assassinated, triggering a massive civil war known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Armies are clashing, the economy is shaking, and many people literally thought the world was ending. But for the Christians, it was even worse. A few years prior, in 64 CE, a massive fire destroyed much of Rome. To deflect blame, Nero scapegoated the Christians. The Roman historian Tacitus tells us that Christians were arrested in vast numbers, covered in animal skins to be torn apart by dogs, or nailed to crosses and set on fire to serve as human torches for Nero's gardens. It was in this specific bloodbath that the great apostles Peter and Paul were martyred. Now, listen to the text's analysis of Mark's pastoral response to this horror. In the midst, or the aftermath, of such events, it may well have seemed particularly timely to warn believers about being led astray by false prophets and false hopes, and to emphasize that followers of Jesus must not be discouraged from proclaiming their message and must prepare themselves for whatever sacrifice may be required of them. Imagine you are a Christian in Rome. Your leaders have just been executed. Your friends have been burned alive. The empire is in chaos. You are tempted to either abandon the faith entirely, or run after apocalyptic fanatics who claim the world is ending tomorrow. Into this absolute nightmare, Mark drops his gospel. He structures the entire middle of his book around 3 stark predictions where Jesus promises that he must suffer, be rejected, and be killed. Mark is staring his traumatized congregation in the eye and saying, the cross is not an accident. The suffering is not a mistake. Do not panic, do not give up, and do not listen to false prophets. The servant is not greater than the master. You must follow the Archie, the founder of the faith, straight into the crucible. Text critical excursus, the implausibility of secret Mark. In advanced academic seminars like ours, we cannot simply read the text, we must also deal with the complex world of textual criticism and the history of how these documents were formed. Over the last few decades, the field of New Testament studies has been repeatedly shaken by sensational claims regarding hidden gospels and suppressed texts. One of the most famous controversies involves the so-called Gospel of Secret Mark. Brilliant scholars, most notably Helmut Kester, developed elaborate theories arguing that the Mark in our Bibles is actually a heavily censored, late edition of the text. Kester proposed a dizzying timeline. He argued there was an original Mark missing large chunks of text, which was later expanded, which then morphed into an esoteric secret Mark used by a heretical sect called the Carpocratians, which was finally watered down by the Orthodox Church into our current canonical Mark. It sounds like the plot of a thriller novel. But let us look at the sober, critical assessment in our reading. Claims that an earlier and significantly different writing, for example secret Mark or a proto-Mark, was used by the authors of Matthew and Luke have justifiably been judged unpersuasive by most scholars. The entire edifice of the secret Mark theory is built on a very shaky foundation. It relies primarily on a single, controversial letter allegedly written by the early church father Clement of Alexandria, discovered in the mid-20th century by Morton Smith. Many highly respected scholars now believe this letter is an outright modern forgery. But even if the letter is authentic antiquity, our text explains why it changes nothing about our Bibles. If the letter is genuine, the secret Mark to which it refers may be at most an ancient but secondary edition of Mark produced in the 2nd century by some group seeking to promote its own esoteric interests. In other words, secret Mark would just be a later fan fiction or heretical corruption of the original text, not the true original itself. Philip Selliu's rigorous textual analysis has proven that Kester's theories fall apart upon close inspection. The textual variants and agreements between Matthew and Luke are far more easily explained by normal scribal habits than by a massive, multi-generational conspiracy to hide secret teachings. Therefore, we can proceed with historical confidence. The massive manuscript evidence we possess allows us to confidently strip away later scribal harmonizations and added endings, proving that the canonical Mark we possess, ending abruptly at chapter 16 verse 8, is indeed the bedrock, original text that served as the foundational source for the other synoptic Gospels. The Matthean augmentation, expanding the Markan framework. As we shift our focus from Mark to the Gospel of Matthew, we witness the fascinating process of early Christian tradition expanding and solidifying. Matthew is a brilliant case study in how early Christians treated their authoritative texts. Matthew clearly had a copy of Mark in front of him on his desk, and he held it in incredibly high regard. We know this because Matthew incorporates a staggering 90% of Mark's Gospel into his own work. He keeps the same basic storyline, the same geographical movements, and the same fundamental theology of the cross. But, Matthew is not merely a scribe mindlessly copying a manuscript. He is a master theologian, writing for a different community with different pressing needs. Let us examine Hurtado's assessment of Matthew's authorial psychology. That Matthew incorporates so much of Mark likely means that the author heavily admired and approved of the basic contents and shape of Mark. Yet, equally obviously, the author felt Mark was not fully adequate. Perhaps he even felt Mark needed correction in some matters. This is a crucial insight into the dynamic nature of early Christian literature. Mark was absolutely perfect for a traumatized church facing immediate martyrdom under Nero. But decades are passing. The church is growing, institutionalizing, and locked in fierce theological debates with Rabbinic Judaism over the interpretation of the Torah. For this new situation, Mark's fast-paced, breathless narrative, which skips over most of Jesus' ethical teachings, was simply not enough. Matthew needed to provide a comprehensive manual for discipleship. So, what does he do? He radically augments the text, resulting in a book that is 60% larger than Mark. Let us look at how the text describes this expansion. Clearly the author had things to say about Jesus that Mark did not convey, or did not convey adequately, and to a considerable degree these things are presented in readily identified bodies of material. Matthew presents an augmented storyline, with significant new material at the beginning and end of Mark's story. Matthew also provides a large body of teaching and sayings material, which he groups in 5 easily recognized discourses. Matthew transforms Mark's survival guide into a majestic, 5-part pedagogical masterpiece. By organizing Jesus' teachings into 5 massive blocks, like the famous Sermon on the Mount, Matthew is deliberately echoing the 5 books of Moses, presenting Jesus as the new, ultimate lawgiver. But beyond the teachings, Matthew realizes he must ground the story of Jesus deeper into the history of Israel. He needs to show not just how Jesus died, but how he arrived on the stage of history. This leads him to add the great narrative bookends, the majestic resurrection appearances at the end, and the profoundly theological nativity narrative at the very beginning. The nativity narratives and the antiquity of the virginal conception. We now turn our attention to one of the most famous, yet historically complex, elements of the Matthean augmentation, the nativity narrative. When we set up our nativity scenes at Christmas, we blend the stories together. We put the wise men from Matthew right next to the shepherds from Luke. But if you read the texts critically, you quickly realize that Matthew and Luke are telling vastly different stories. Matthew focuses on Joseph, dreams, the star, Herod's paranoia, and the flight to Egypt. Luke focuses on Mary, the birth of John the Baptist, the census, the manger, and the temple. They do not share a single narrative scene. From a historical perspective, this raises a massive question: where did the idea of the virgin birth come from, and how old is it? Let us look at what Raymond Brown and Larry Hurtado conclude. In light of the considerable differences between the Matthean and Lucan nativity narratives, it is most unlikely that either narrative derives from the other, or that there was a common source narrative. In historical studies, if 2 authors tell identical stories, we assume one copied the other. But Matthew and Luke are acting completely independently here. There is no literary link between their infancy accounts. However, this is where it gets incredibly exciting. Despite having completely different plots, different geography, and different characters, both authors independently converge on a few absolutely non-negotiable core facts. Jesus is of the line of David, his birth was announced by an angel, and most importantly, he was miraculously conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit without a human father. What does this mean historically? Let us examine the text's conclusion. I think it is difficult to imagine these common features as coincidental agreements, especially the joint testimony to Jesus' conception through the Holy Spirit. Instead, it is highly likely that the basic idea of Jesus' miraculous and virginal conception was earlier than either account. This is the principle of independent attestation. If 2 unconnected witnesses agree on a highly unusual, miraculous claim, it proves that neither of them invented it. The doctrine of the virginal conception was not a late myth invented by Matthew or Luke to make Jesus look like a Greek demigod. Because it is embedded independently in both texts, the idea must have been circulating widely and with great authority in the early Christian movement long before these Gospels were written, likely going back into the early 60s or even 50s of the first century. It was an ancient, foundational piece of Christological devotion that both evangelists felt compelled to include in their expanded biographies. Mark 6 verse 3, the Son of Mary, slur. If the doctrine of the virginal conception predates Matthew and Luke, can we find any trace of it in our earliest Gospel, Mark? Mark does not have a birth narrative, but he does contain one incredibly fascinating, seemingly throwaway line that has generated massive scholarly debate. In Mark chapter 6, Jesus returns to his hometown of Nazareth, and the locals are deeply offended by his authoritative teaching. In their anger, they say, "Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary?" Now, to modern ears, calling someone the son of Mary sounds perfectly harmless and descriptive. But in the rigidly patriarchal society of first-century Judaism, it was a profound insult. Let us see how the scholars interpret this. With Marcus, I judge it likely that this matronymic reference to Jesus by those pictured in the scene as offended by him, is to be taken as their slur against his legitimacy. In the ancient Near East, a person's entire identity, legal status, and honor were tied to their father. You were Simon, son of Jonah, or James, son of Zebedee. The only time a man was publicly identified by his mother's name, what we call a matronymic, was if the father was completely unknown, or if the circumstances of the birth were so scandalous that the legal father refused to claim the child. By calling Jesus the son of Mary, the crowd in Mark's narrative is not just putting him down as a common laborer, they are throwing a horrific slur at his mother. They are calling him illegitimate. The fact that this was viewed as a dangerous slur is proven by how the other gospel writers react to it. Let us look at the text again. It is certainly interesting that all the parallel statements in Matthew 13 verse 55, Luke 4 verse 22, and John 6 verse 42 refer to Jesus as the son of Joseph, probably reflecting their reverential efforts to avoid the sort of expression found here. Matthew and Luke had Mark's text right in front of them, but they deliberately scrubbed the insult out. They were deeply embarrassed by the phrase son of Mary, so they smoothed it over, changing it to the carpenter's son, or the son of Joseph, to protect Jesus' honor. So, Mark has preserved an incredibly early, raw memory of a vicious Jewish polemic against Jesus. But what is the actual origin of this slur? Did the Jews invent it out of thin air, or was it a reaction to something the Christians were already claiming? That is the historical puzzle we must solve next. Refuting the illegitimacy hypothesis. We now enter a fierce debate regarding the origin of the virgin birth tradition. We have two historical data points, the Christian claim that Jesus was conceived by the Holy Spirit, and the Jewish slur that Jesus was an illegitimate bastard, referred to as the son of Mary. The massive historical question is, which came first? The doctrine, or the slur? A vocal group of modern scholars, spearheaded by Jane Schaberg and Gerd Ludemann, argue that the slur came first. They claim that Mary actually suffered an out-of-wedlock pregnancy, and that Mark 6 verse 3 is preserving the bitter, historical gossip of the villagers in Nazareth who knew the dirty truth. In their view, decades later, the Christian church was so embarrassed by this illegitimacy that they invented a theological cover-up, claiming, no, she wasn't unfaithful, she was impregnated by God. Let us examine Hurtado's forceful deconstruction of this theory. In my view, however, this is not a persuasive proposal for at least two reasons. First, it involves reading Mark 6 verse 3 somewhat naively, as if it preserves some local gossip from Nazareth, and as if the author had the capacity or interest to do so. Surely all critical study of the Jesus tradition recognizes that the material in the Gospels is there because it was meaningful in some way to the intended readers. Hurtado is reminding us of basic literary criticism. The Gospel writers were not newspaper reporters carrying around audio recorders. They were theologians. Mark did not include the phrase Son of Mary just to preserve random village gossip for antiquarian reasons. He included it because it resonated with the religious polemics his readers were facing in their own day. But Hurtado's second point is even more devastating to the Schaberg-Ludemann hypothesis, and it has to do with basic human logic and ancient public relations. Let us look at the text. To claim a miraculous conception with no identifiable father does not appear terribly wise if early Christians simply wanted to refute successfully the slur that Jesus was illegitimate. Think about this logically. If your religious opponents are mercilessly mocking your founder for being an illegitimate bastard, how do you defend him? You do not respond by saying, actually, his mother became pregnant by an invisible Holy Spirit without a human father. In the ancient Jewish world, that sounds insane. It is an apologetic disaster. It is a counter-assertion that, as Hurtado says, would almost invite further scurrilous comments. If the Christians were just trying to put out the fire of an illegitimacy rumor, the easiest and smartest thing to do would be to fiercely assert that Jesus was the fully legitimate, biological son of Joseph, from the noble line of David. The fact that they maintained the dangerous, highly mockable claim of a virginal conception proves it was not a defensive lie. It must have been an offensive, foundational truth of their faith. Virginal conception as primary doxology. We have dismantled the idea that the virgin birth was a desperate cover-up. So, we are left with the final, thrilling conclusion regarding the origin of this profound doctrine. If it was not a defensive lie, what was it? It was a primary, offensive explosion of worship. It was what scholars call a doxological statement. Let us read Hurtado's final synthesis on this matter. I think it more likely that the claim that Jesus was miraculously conceived circulated originally, not as a reply to slurs about Jesus' birth, but as a doxological statement intended to assert Jesus' significance. More specifically, it was a way of referring to Jesus as truly and uniquely come from God, from his earthly origins in the womb onward. This completely flips the chronology of the debate and aligns perfectly with the historical evidence. Let me map out exactly how this happened in the early decades of the first century. Step 1. The early Christians, utterly transformed by their encounters with the resurrected Christ, begin to reflect deeply on his identity. Through the guidance of the Spirit, they assert that a man this divine, this perfectly aligned with God's will, did not just become God's Son at his baptism or his resurrection. He was intrinsically divine from the very moment of his conception. They begin to proclaim joyfully that he was conceived directly by the Holy Spirit. Step 2. This doxological, worshipful claim begins to circulate in the synagogues and marketplaces of Judea and Galilee. Step 3. Hostile Jewish audiences, who completely reject Jesus as the Messiah, hear this incredible claim. They hear the Christians saying, he had no human father. And the opponents weaponize it. They twist the glorious theological claim into a malicious, fleshly slur. They say, oh, he had no father. Then he is a bastard, the illegitimate son of Mary. Do you see the brilliance of this historical reconstruction? The ugly slur of illegitimacy did not create the virgin birth doctrine, the virgin birth doctrine provoked the slur. Therefore, when we read Mark 6 verse 3, where the crowd calls Jesus the son of Mary, we are actually looking at a hostile, inverted proof of early Christian orthodoxy. Because that slur was already circulating widely enough for Mark to include it in his gospel around the year 70, the doxological claim that provoked it, the belief in the miraculous conception, must be incredibly ancient. It pushes the roots of high Christology, the belief in the intrinsic divinity of Jesus from the womb to the tomb, right back into the very earliest, foundational layers of the Christian movement. It proves that binitarian devotion was not a late corruption, but the original heartbeat of the faith. Welcome to the concluding session of our 15-week doctoral seminar. We now enter Part 3, Conclusion and Application. Throughout this course, we have traced the trajectory of Proto-Orthodox devotion, examining the consolidation of binitarian worship and major doctrinal developments in the early Church. In this final section, we turn our meticulous attention to the synoptic renditions of Jesus. Our primary goal today is to apply all that we have learned to the specific textual evidence of the synoptic Gospels, focusing on how these narratives served as the bedrock for early Christian devotion. The application of these texts demonstrates how early believers articulated their reverence for Christ amidst severe historical turmoil and intense theological polemics. We will see that the Synoptic Gospels are not merely historical chronicles or simple biographies. Rather, they are profound, sophisticated theological documents that actively shaped the liturgical and devotional life of the earliest Christian communities. Larry Hurtado observes that the synoptic renditions of Jesus introduced a more specific and restrictive self-reference into Jesus' sayings, which then became regularized as a way of expressing his particular significance in early Christian faith. This insight is absolutely crucial for our application today. When we read the Gospels, we are quite literally witnessing the regularization of early devotion. The early Christians were carefully transmitting the traditions of their master, but they were doing so in a way that intentionally highlighted his unique identity. This was not an accidental byproduct of oral tradition, it was a deliberate, spirit-led process of theological consolidation. Let me paint a picture for you. Imagine a linguistic bridge being built from the Aramaic-speaking world of Galilee to the Greek-speaking world of the broader Roman Empire. As the early church carried the memories of Jesus across this bridge, they selected specific words and phrases that would precisely capture the majestic authority of the one they worshipped. Hurtado notes that scholars like Paul Owen and David Shepard have recently provided detailed studies of relevant Aramaic expressions in extant texts from the time of Jesus, and their results are directly relevant to our understanding of this process. This brings us to a critical methodological application for our own research. For decades, prominent scholarship relied heavily on Aramaic evidence from periods far removed from the 1st century, or from dialects entirely outside Roman Judea. It is, as Hurtado aptly compares, a bit like using modern American English to propose the meanings of words and expressions in Elizabethan English texts. You simply cannot do that and expect accurate historical results. But in the last few decades, the continuing publication of texts from Qumran has significantly expanded the database for establishing features of the Aramaic of Jesus' time and locale. This revolutionizes our understanding. It allows us to firmly root the synoptic vocabulary in the actual linguistic environment of Jesus. Therefore, as we apply these findings today, we must recognize that the devotional language of the early church was grounded in a highly specific historical reality. It was not a later Hellenistic invention overlaid onto a simple Jewish rabbi, but a development deeply connected to the Palestinian Jewish context itself. Hurtado writes, Jesus' Aramaic expressions became regularized as a way of expressing Jesus' particular significance in early Christian faith. This regularization is the very essence of Proto-Orthodox consolidation. It is the process by which diverse, localized traditions were brought together to form a coherent, universally recognized pattern of binitarian worship, a worship that reverenced Jesus alongside God the Father. The early Christians were not merely remembering Jesus of Nazareth, they were actively worshiping the risen Christ, and their written texts reflect the blazing intensity of that devotion. As we move through this concluding presentation, we will explore the specific titles, the underlying narrative structures, and the historical crises that profoundly shaped this devotion. We will see how the Son of Man sayings, the Markan emphasis on suffering discipleship, and the fiercely debated traditions surrounding Jesus' birth all contributed to a robust, intellectually rigorous, and profoundly worshipful early Christian movement. This is the ultimate application of our entire 15-week study, to fully grasp that Proto-Orthodox devotion was a dynamic, historically grounded, and textually rich phenomenon that forever altered the religious landscape of antiquity, laying the permanent foundation for all subsequent Christian theology. Now, let us delve into the intricate linguistic pragmatics and the Aramaic matrix of early Christian devotion. When we talk about how the early church understood Jesus, we have to start with the language Jesus himself spoke, Aramaic. For a very long time, the academic consensus on this topic was dominated by scholars who looked at the Aramaic background of the Gospels and drew conclusions that stripped Jesus of any unique, self-referential claims. Scholars like Gaza Vermes and Maurice Casey heavily influenced the field by arguing that the Aramaic equivalent for Son of Man was simply an ordinary way of referring to human beings generically. They claimed it was just a common idiom, much like saying a guy or one in modern English. However, we must apply rigorous historical scrutiny to this claim. Hurtado points out that Vermes and subsequent scholars tended to rest their views heavily on Aramaic texts from periods considerably outside Jesus' time, and on evidence from Aramaic dialects other than that of first-century Roman Judea. This is a monumental flaw in methodology. If you want to know what a phrase meant in first-century Judea, you cannot rely primarily on texts written hundreds of years later in completely different regions, such as the later Jewish Targums or rabbinic writings. It completely ignores the living, evolving nature of language. Thankfully, the discovery and continuing analysis of the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran has drastically altered this landscape. Paul Owen and David Shepard have meticulously surveyed these relevant Qumran Aramaic texts, and their findings are nothing short of paradigm-shifting for New Testament Christology. They discovered that in the Aramaic dialect of Jesus' specific provenance, the semantic distinction between the definite and absolute forms of nouns had not eroded away. What does this mean in practical terms? It means that the specific phrase, bar anasha, with the definite article attached, was not just thrown around loosely as a generic substitute for humanity. Hurtado summarizes their findings by stating, the broad effect of which is to place in strong doubt the claim that the Aramaic equivalents to Son of Man were simply the ordinary ways of referring to human beings generically. In fact, Owen and Shepard demonstrated that if someone in first-century Judea just wanted to say, man, there were other Aramaic terms available and much more commonly used, such as, gabar. The definite singular expression, bar anasha, simply does not appear as a generic idiom in the texts of Jesus' provenance. This completely shatters the older consensus. We can decisively conclude that the relevant Aramaic evidence does not provide solid linguistic grounds for the solution offered by Vermes and Casey. So, what is the application for our understanding of Proto-Orthodox devotion? It forces us to recognize that the linguistic uniqueness of the Gospel texts accurately reflects a profound historical reality. Jesus was not walking around Galilee referring to himself with a mundane, generic idiom that his later followers accidentally misunderstood and transformed into a divine title. Instead, as Hurtado confidently proposes, Jesus' own speech practice could easily have included an Aramaic expression capable of being used in statements with a particularizing connotation. Jesus was intentionally using language in a novel, arresting way to single himself out. He was employing what linguists call speech act semantics, adapting idiomatic expressions to convey a highly specific, profound meaning about his unique mission and identity. This historical, Aramaic reality became the beating heart of early Christian devotion. The early believers preserved this particularizing connotation because they recognized that it was the authentic voice of their master, laying down the linguistic foundation upon which all subsequent binitarian worship would eventually be built. Moving forward from the Aramaic background, we must now examine the fascinating transition of this tradition into the Greek-speaking world. The translation of Jesus' Aramaic self-referential speech into Greek resulted in a truly unprecedented linguistic construction, ho huios tou anthropou, which we translate as, the Son of Man. To fully appreciate the theological application of this phrase, we have to realize just how utterly bizarre it sounded to a native Greek speaker in the 1st century. It was an absolute neologism, a completely new grammatical invention. Hurtado emphasizes a staggering fact: not only does ho huios tou anthropou not occur prior to the Gospels in extant literature composed in Greek, it is also not found once among the scores of times the translators of the Greek Old Testament rendered the Semitic expressions for a Son of Man. It is not even found in the extant Greek portions of the apocalyptic book of 1st Enoch. It is a completely novel invention. Some scholars, attempting to minimize the theological weight of this phrase, have argued that it was just a clunky, accidental mistranslation, a case of bilingual interference where someone literally translated an Aramaic phrase without understanding Greek grammar. But Hurtado dismisses this, arguing, I think it far more likely that ho huios tou anthropou was deliberately constructed from the first by, and in, bilingual circles of Jesus' followers to serve as his distinctive self-referential expression. Think about the profound application of this insight. The earliest Christians were not careless translators who accidentally stumbled into high Christology. They were careful, reverent, and deeply intentional bilingual communities. When they translated the traditions of their Lord, they deliberately forged a completely new Greek phrase because no existing Greek phrase could adequately capture the staggering majesty of what Jesus had claimed about himself. But what did this strange phrase actually communicate to its original audience? Hurtado observes that original readers and hearers would have recognized that it was not an ordinary idiom in Greek, but was similar to expressions in the Greek Old Testament. It had a profound scriptural resonance. It sounded exactly like what we might call Bible Greek. When early Christians heard it, their minds were immediately drawn to the sacred texts of Israel. Even more importantly, we must consider the grammatical force of the Greek definite article, the word the. In Greek, the definite article particularizes an individual member of a group or class. It points out, it sets apart, it emphatically identifies. Therefore, the semantic force of the expression, Hurtado argues, was almost certainly to posit Jesus as somehow a human figure of particular significance. He is not just a son of man, he is the Son of Man. This brings us to a crucial conclusion. In the Gospels, the Son of Man is not a pre-existing apocalyptic title for an established office that Jesus simply adopted. Rather, it functioned much more like a unique, personal name. It was Jesus' exclusive, sacred way of referring to himself. The fact that early Christians preserved this awkward Greek phrase so meticulously, and never put it in the mouths of anyone other than Jesus, shows a profound, trembling reverence for his specific idiolect, his personal way of speaking. This deliberate, bilingual Christological act of constructing and preserving, ho huios tou anthropou, was a massive step in the consolidation of proto-Orthodox devotion, forever cementing Jesus as the unique, eschatological human figure standing at the center of the divine drama. As we continue our application of the synoptic evidence, we arrive at one of the most beautiful and profound theological realities in the New Testament, the Christological paradox. We have established that, the Son of Man, was a unique, deliberately constructed phrase that Jesus used exclusively to refer to himself. Hurtado points out a fascinating feature of the Gospel texts: we do not find the expression except on the lips of Jesus. Early Christians had such an immense reverence for what they understood to be Jesus' own speech practice that they absolutely hesitated to use it as their own statements about him. They reserved it entirely for when they represented the voice of Jesus. This linguistic boundary is a powerful testament to the intense devotional atmosphere of the early church. But what is the core theological function of this expression? The semantic force of the expression, Hurtado argues, is an emphatic reference to Jesus as human being, the human descendant. It grounds Jesus deeply in human reality. It emphasizes his tremendous particularity. The Gospels do not present a mystical, floating spirit being, they quite deliberately set him within the chronological, geographical, ethnic, and political particularities of early first-century Roman Judea. He is a real man, in real history, sweating and suffering under the hot Palestinian sun. However, and this is where the genius of the synoptic renditions shines, this profound emphasis on his humanity does not exist in isolation. Hurtado draws our attention to a vital observation: in the discourse world of the canonical Gospels, this emphatic way of referring to Jesus as human functions along with the clear assertion of Jesus' transcendent significance, even his intrinsic divinity. The human particularity is inextricably bound to a staggering, divine reality. This transcendent dimension is primarily communicated through the presentation of Jesus as God's Son, a theme that features prominently across all four Gospel accounts. Therefore, when we read the Gospels, we are constantly confronted with the pairing of two related, yet contrasting, filial categories. Hurtado notes, surely, early readers of these accounts could not have avoided the pairing of these two related and contrasting ways of referring to Jesus in filial terms, as the Son of Man and God's Son. The application of this pairing is the very foundation of Proto-Orthodox Christology. The title, the Son of Man, designates Jesus operating firmly within the human, historical sphere, experiencing our limitations and sorrows. Simultaneously, the title, Son of God, spectacularly discloses the higher, eternal significance of who this human figure really is. This dynamic, paradoxical relationship is fiercely operative in Mark and completely saturates the other canonical Gospels as well. When we talk about the consolidation of binitarian worship, we are talking precisely about how early Christians learned to hold these two explosive truths together in a unified act of devotion. They worshipped a God who was entirely transcendent, yet who had definitively revealed himself in the Son of Man. The Christological paradox of the Synoptic Gospels is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be adored, and it remains the absolute bedrock of all authentic Christian worship. Having established the linguistic and paradoxical foundations of Synoptic Christology, let us now focus our analytical lens specifically on the Gospel of Mark. Mark's rendition of Jesus is a masterpiece of theological narrative, and one of its most critical features is how it inextricably links the story of Jesus with the larger narrative world of Old Testament scripture. Mark does not present Jesus as a new, detached religious philosopher, he presents him as the explosive climax of Israel's long, prophetic history. The application here is vital. Proto-Orthodox devotion did not invent a new religion, it claimed the fulfillment of an ancient one. Hurtado points out that the Markan use of Old Testament scripture has been studied superbly by scholars like Joel Marcus. The most illuminating example of this is found in the very opening sentences of the Gospel. Immediately following what serves as the book's title in verse 1, Mark drops a massive theological anchor. He provides a composite quotation drawn from Isaiah 40, Malachi 3, and Exodus 23. This quotation functions to introduce the entirety of the Markan account of Jesus. The text reads, "Behold, I send my messenger before your face who will prepare your way. A voice crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his paths." Now, we must pay very close attention to the mechanics of this text. In the original Old Testament context of Isaiah and Malachi, the Lord refers explicitly to Yahweh, the God of Israel. But in Mark's narrative construction, God is sending a messenger, John the Baptist, ahead of another figure, and that figure is unmistakably Jesus. As Marcus has brilliantly shown, Mark then presents the subsequent account of Jesus' entire ministry as the way of the Lord. By doing this, Mark accomplishes two monumental things simultaneously. First, he links Jesus' appearance directly with the sacred scriptures of Israel. Second, and more radically, he makes a profound statement about Jesus, associating him so closely with God that the actions of Jesus become the very arrival of Yahweh on earth. This is staggering Christological exegesis. Furthermore, Mark's text is saturated with unintroduced citations and subtle scriptural allusions. For example, when Mark describes the healing of the deaf and mute man in chapter 7, he uses specific Greek vocabulary found only in Isaiah 35 in the Greek Old Testament. He doesn't explicitly say, "This fulfills Isaiah," he expects his readers to hear the echo. Hurtado notes that these allusions suggest an impressive familiarity with the specific Greek wording of the Old Testament by intended readers. Mark is presuming an audience that is deeply fluent in the Septuagint. Although formally a miracle story, the healing is implicitly rehearsed as fulfillment of Scripture and as part of the eschatological drama that is Jesus' ministry. What is the application for our study of early devotion? It proves that from the very beginning, Christian worship of Jesus was profoundly intellectual and textual. The early church did not construct a binitarian theology out of thin air or pagan mythology, they forged it in the crucible of intense, spirit-led exegesis of the Hebrew Scriptures. Markan Christology consolidates devotion by seamlessly identifying the saving actions of Jesus with the promised, eschatological actions of Yahweh himself. In our continued analysis of Mark, we must recognize that his gospel does much more than simply make theological claims about Jesus, it radically intertwines who Jesus is with how a Christian must live. In Mark, Christology is directly bound to discipleship. Mark makes a very emphatic connection between Jesus and those called to follow him. The Markan story elicits others to literally enter the narrative, to follow Jesus in his way, and to further his mission in their own turbulent lives. This is clearly seen in Mark's use of the term gospel or euangelion. The very first verse famously declares, "The beginning, the arche, of the gospel of Jesus Christ." Hurtado argues powerfully that this word archi refers to the whole of the following account. Jesus' own activity in Mark is the archi, the supreme origin, foundation, and authoritative pattern for his followers. Because Jesus is the foundation, Mark presents him with a striking degree of what scholar John Donahue calls human realism. Mark portrays a Jesus who experiences a series of intense, raw emotions. We see him moved with pity, flashing with violent displeasure, burning with anger, sighing deeply in sorrow, and marveling at the stubborn disbelief of his hometown. Mark even includes shocking moments where Jesus is portrayed as not knowing something, such as who touched his garment in the crowd, or the exact day and hour of the final judgment. It is fascinating to note that Matthew and Luke, when they copy Mark, frequently alter or omit these very raw emotional details. But Mark's realism is entirely deliberate. His Jesus successfully proceeds through his terrifying mission to his divinely ordained fate while exhibiting the very real emotions and limitations of knowledge that help make him an intensely inspiring example for readers. If Jesus is the perfect example, then what are we to make of his closest followers in the narrative? As many scholars have observed, Mark presents the 12 disciples in a noticeably more negative manner than any other gospel. They are constantly depicted as dull, fearful, and lacking understanding. Ultimately, their story ends in catastrophic failure, complete desertion in Gethsemane and Peter's horrific apostasy in the courtyard. Why would Mark portray the founding fathers of the church so terribly? It is completely simplistic to view this merely as an attack on the historical apostles. Instead, their failures serve as vivid, pastoral warnings to the readers. Mark is screaming to his audience that following Jesus is an incredibly difficult and dangerous venture. But crucially, Mark also includes Jesus' prediction of their restoration, proving that failures can be overcome by Jesus' own faithfulness. The profound application of this narrative strategy is beautifully summarized by Philip Davis. The Markan storyline is quite literally a blueprint for the Christian life. It begins with a baptism in the Jordan, issues immediately into mission and severe opposition, leads to persecution and a brutal cross, and finally ends with the promise of divine vindication by resurrection. For the early Christians, proto-Orthodox devotion was not merely an intellectual exercise, it was a gritty, dangerous participation in the life of Jesus. Mark forces his readers to look at the cross and realize that authentic binitarian devotion requires a willingness to suffer just as the Master did. To truly comprehend the application and the sheer urgency of the Gospel of Mark, we must rip it out of the quiet, sterile environment of a library and place it back into the bloody, chaotic historical context in which it was forged. We are asking the critical historical question, why was this book written when it was? It is a highly reasonable supposition that the devastating, traumatic events connected with the Jewish revolt against Rome in the late 60s are reflected heavily in Mark's narrative, especially in chapter 13. The author saw in these global distresses particular, deadly dangers to the believers for whom he wrote. The years of the Jewish revolt were apocalyptic in their intensity. In the year 68 alone, the Emperor Nero was assassinated, and the Roman Empire descended into civil war, with 3 different emperors coming and going in a single year. The world seemed to be tearing itself apart. More terrifyingly, the reign of Nero in the 60s was marked by particularly violent, state-sponsored actions against Christians, especially in Rome, resulting in the martyrdom of the apostles Peter and Paul. Whether Mark was composed in Rome or somewhere like Syria, the hideous sufferings of the Roman Christians and the apocalyptic war in Judea were matters of supreme, agonizing import to the author. In the midst, or the immediate aftermath, of such earth-shattering events, Mark realized it was a matter of life and death to warn believers. He needed to ensure they would not be led astray by false prophets claiming the end had come, and to emphasize that followers of Jesus must prepare themselves for whatever brutal sacrifice the empire might require of them. The eschatological discourse in Mark 13 is a transparent, direct address to these traumatized readers. Jesus explicitly warns that they will be dragged before councils and beaten. But perhaps the most brilliant and heartbreaking pastoral application in Mark is found in the story of Peter's denial. Hurtado highlights a fascinating proposal regarding the specific Greek vocabulary Mark uses to describe Peter's failure. The verbs used in Mark's account of Peter's interrogation by the serving girl, deny, and curse, portray Peter's actions precisely in the terminology of apostasy. In fact, this terminology perfectly matches later Roman judicial practice where Christians were forced to curse Christ under torture. Mark is drawing a direct, terrifying parallel. He intends the interleaved accounts of Jesus standing firm before the high priest, and Peter completely breaking down in the courtyard, to give readers both a positive and a negative model of behavior under interrogation. But the ultimate genius of Mark is that he does not end Peter's story there. Jesus promises to meet the disciples in Galilee, and the angel specifically names Peter for restoration in chapter 16. The application is profound. Mark was written to a church bleeding from persecution, offering a severe warning against apostasy, but pairing it with the radical, staggering grace that even those who broke under the terror of Nero could be restored by the blood of Christ. This is how early Christian devotion consolidated its resilience, by looking to the suffering, yet victorious, Son of Man. Having thoroughly examined the crisis-driven narrative of Mark, we must now turn our attention to the magnificent Gospel of Matthew to see how early Christian devotion continued to expand and consolidate. The relationship between Matthew and Mark is fascinating and highly revealing. On the one hand, Matthew is a vivid, undeniable demonstration of the immense circulation and influence of the Gospel of Mark. Matthew actually incorporates some 90% of Mark's text into his own. That Matthew relies so heavily on Mark undoubtedly means that he heavily admired and approved of the basic contents and theological shape of Mark's story. He saw Mark as fundamentally true. Yet, equally obviously, Matthew felt that Mark was not fully adequate for the specific needs of his own community. Matthew felt compelled to produce an account that is nearly 60% larger than Mark. Clearly, the author had things to say about Jesus that Mark did not convey, or did not convey with enough systematic detail. We call this the Matthean augmentation. So, how did Matthew augment the tradition? First and foremost, he provided a massive body of teaching and sayings material, which he brilliantly grouped into 5 easily recognized discourses, the most famous being the Sermon on the Mount. By doing this, Matthew presents Jesus not just as the suffering servant, but as the supreme, authoritative teacher of the new eschatological community. But the most striking and consequential augmentation occurs at the very beginning of the narrative. Unlike Mark, which begins with Jesus as an adult at the Jordan River, Matthew provides a sweeping genealogy and a profound nativity account. Both Matthew and Luke, independently of one another, precede their Markan-shaped story of Jesus' ministry with an account of his miraculous birth. What is the application of this immense literary expansion? It shows us the evolution of proto-Orthodox consolidation. If Mark was the gritty, urgent survival manual written for a traumatized church facing immediate martyrdom, Matthew represents the maturing, systematizing phase of the Christian movement. Matthew provides a comprehensive, institutionally robust foundation for the believers. The church was growing, engaging in intense debates with formative Judaism, and it needed a massive, authoritative text to define its ethics, its history, and its worship. By adding the birth narrative, Matthew pushes the Christological claim back to the very moment of conception. He demands that his readers recognize that Jesus is not just an ordinary man whom God adopted at baptism, but the royal son of David, miraculously conceived by the Holy Spirit, Emmanuel, God with us. This sweeping Matthean augmentation ensured that Binitarian devotion possessed the intellectual and textual depth necessary to endure for millennia. Let us look deeper into this Matthean augmentation, specifically focusing on the most controversial and beautiful element, the nativity account. In a strict historical approach to the origins and meaning of the idea that Jesus was miraculously conceived by the Holy Spirit, we begin by noting that the earliest explicit references are found only in Matthew 1 and Luke 1. The immediate historical question we must ask is, where did this belief come from, and how early is it? As scholars like Raymond Brown have cogently demonstrated, when you place Matthew and Luke side by side, their nativity narratives are vastly different in their details. It is incredibly unlikely that Matthew copied Luke, or that Luke copied Matthew. Yet, sitting right in the center of both distinct narratives is the exact same, explosive claim, an angelic announcement and a conception by the power of the Holy Spirit. Hurtado rightly argues that it is practically impossible to imagine these common features as mere coincidental agreements. Instead, it is highly likely that the basic, core idea of Jesus' miraculous and virginal conception was significantly earlier than either written account. We have to allow enough historical time for this idea to have circulated widely enough to become known independently to both authors in different parts of the empire. We must take the idea back at least a decade earlier than the composition of the Gospels, likely to the mid-60s or 70s CE, and perhaps even earlier if they utilized pre-existing birth traditions. This forces us to ask a second, highly debated question: why did the early church start claiming this? Some modern scholars have cynically suggested that the story of the virgin birth was invented as a desperate apologetic cover-up because people were claiming Jesus was an illegitimate child. But Hurtado utterly dismantles this theory. He points out that claiming a miraculous conception with no identifiable human father is a terrible strategy if your only goal is to logically refute a rumor of illegitimacy. If the church was just trying to defend Jesus' legal status, they would simply have insisted on his full legitimacy and provided a solid, normal genealogy. So, what is the true origin of this belief? Hurtado argues brilliantly that the claim of miraculous conception circulated originally, not as a defensive reply to slurs about Jesus' birth, but as a primary, triumphant doxological statement intended to assert Jesus' staggering significance. Doxology means the language of worship and glory. It was the early church's way of emphatically declaring that Jesus truly and uniquely came from God, straight from his earthly origins in the womb onward. The application for us is profound. The virginal conception is a bedrock component of Proto-Orthodox Christology. It was not a later myth or a clumsy defense mechanism, it was the spontaneous, spirit-inspired eruption of worship. The early believers utilized these sacred birth narratives to articulate the deep, unfathomable mystery of the Incarnation, providing a glorious, compelling origin story that perfectly matched the magnificent divine identity of the resurrected Lord they worshipped every Sunday. As we bring our seminar to its final conclusion, we must look at how early Christian devotion collided with the hostile world around it, producing fierce religious polemics. We find a fascinating, and somewhat shocking, example of this in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, verse 3. In this scene, the people of Jesus' hometown take deep offense at him, and they ask, "Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary?" Now, in the ancient Near East, a man was almost universally identified by his father's name, not his mother's. To call a grown man the son of Mary was highly unusual. Scholars like Joel Marcus recognize this matronymic reference as a direct slur against Jesus' legitimacy. It was a grave insult. It is very telling that when Matthew, Luke, and John tell similar stories, they completely remove this phrase, reverentially calling Jesus the son of Joseph, to protect him from the insult. But Mark leaves the brutal slur right in the text. Why? And where did this slur come from? Some have theorized that the historical Jesus actually was illegitimate, and that the church invented the virgin birth to cover it up. But we have already proven that to be historically implausible. Hurtado offers a far more historically rigorous and fascinating sequence of events. He proposes that the prior claim that Jesus was miraculously conceived was already circulating widely as a glorious, doxological statement of worship. As the early Christians loudly proclaimed this miracle, it generated massive friction with their non-believing Jewish neighbors. Once the Christian assertion of the virgin birth was circulating, it is incredibly easy to understand how intense religious polemics would have generated a hostile counterclaim. The neighbors took the Christian claim of a miraculous birth and viciously twisted it into an accusation of illegitimacy. Therefore, the slur that Jesus was a bastard did not come first, it was a hostile reaction to the pre-existing Christian devotion. So why did Mark deliberately leave this painful slur in his gospel? Because Mark is a master of profound narrative irony. We see this throughout his gospel, like when the soldiers mockingly crown Jesus, King of the Jews, unwittingly declaring the absolute truth. Mark does the exact same thing here in chapter 6. The hostile crowd meant to insult Jesus, but Mark's Christian readers, reading the text decades later, would have smiled at the profound irony. The intended readers were expected to know the claim that he really is the Son of Mary and not the offspring of a human father, precisely because he was conceived by a divine miracle. The enemies of Jesus were unwittingly preaching proto-Orthodox Christology. This brings us to our final application for this entire 15-week course. The consolidation of Binitarian worship and proto-Orthodox doctrine did not happen in a peaceful, quiet vacuum. It occurred within a blazing crucible of fierce religious polemics, imperial persecution, and internal trauma. The early church was forced to refine, defend, and deeply embed their high Christology into the authoritative texts of the Synoptic Gospels. The majestic, paradoxical, and glorious portrait of Jesus that we possess today, the Son of Man who suffered, the Son of God who reigns, the violently rejected yet miraculously conceived Lord, is the direct result of an ancient, unyielding devotion that simply refused to compromise the absolute supremacy of Jesus Christ. Thank you for joining me on this profound journey into the heart of early Christian faith.